Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It is 4 p.m. ET, and this is Mighty Mysteries on a Mighty Blaze. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And we are so glad that you could join us today. In this bizarre week between holidays, we have yet another holiday gift for you of a wonderful author with a brand new book. And we will talk to Charlie Donlea today. I'm Hank Phillippi Ryan, and I'm so pleased to be able to show you. Look at this book, which came in, I'll show you this, an evidence bag. How awesome is that? And voila, it is called 20 Years Later. An absolutely riveting thriller by Charlie Donlea, which you will love. And we will meet Charlie Donlea in 1 second. I'm in Boston. I'm Hank Phillippi Ryan, and I welcome you all to Mighty Mysteries on a Mighty Blaze today. We are so pleased that you could join us again this afternoon. Charlie Donlea, you are in Chicago, is that right? I'm in Boston, where it is drizzly and gray. And what's it like in Chicago?
It's snowing, our first snowfall of the year.
Blizzardy snow or just delicate, gorgeous welcome to the New Year's snow?
A little delicate, but we have family flying out, so it's delicate snow is still a little threatening when it's the first of the year.
Yeah, a delicate situation as well. Congratulations on 20 Years Later, which is out today. Shannon Hansen is saying, so excited for this book, Hi from Minnesota. And I love that evidence bag, which is such a perfect presentation for this book. How has launch day been?
Launch day has been exciting. I've been waiting for this interview. It was interrupted by the snowfall because, like I said, our in-laws were trying to get out, and I still have my phone here, seeing if their plane's going to take off. But it's been a fun day. I've heard from a lot of good friends and family. New sort of release. I went through this last time. We're not doing an event, a live event, but making the most of it. It's been really exciting.
Well, you're a USA Today bestselling author. Does it ever get to be la-di-da and every day to have a book launch?
Never. Hank, my box of books arrived December 23rd. I was excited to open my 6th box of books the other day as I was my first, so never gets old.
And I love this cover, Charlie. This is so evocative because not only that someone is obviously on a road trip, but the shape is so gorgeous as well. It really is so emblematic, symbolic of something else. And we'll talk about that in a minute. When you saw the cover, what did you think?
Well, so it's interesting. This was the first cover, and I loved it immediately because of all of what you just talked about. The main character's on a road trip. She's in a red car, and there's lots of mysterious things happening. Then we changed the cover to something else pre-production, and this is the first time I've really fought for something where I wanted it, and I thought that I had it right. And after a little bit of a struggle, not much, but a little bit of voicing my opinion, we all agreed we went back to this cover, and we've had great feedback on it. So I'm happy we stuck with it.
Well, maybe later in the interview, we'll talk about what possible cover they might have chosen that I wonder if it was more specific than this gorgeous one is. But I agree that it is marvelous. Let me tell you, if you've just joined us now, I'm Hank Phillippi Ryan. This is Mighty Mysteries on a Mighty Blaze. We are talking to Charlie Donlea, the author of the brand new 20 Years Later, which is just out today. If you're joining us for the first time, that's so great. Thank you. You know, A Mighty Blaze was started at the beginning of the pandemic, nigh on to 2 years ago, which is craziness, by Caroline Levitt and Jenna Blum, the powerhouse team, to bring us all together to keep us talking about books and discovering new books and stay together as a sort of writerly, readerly community. And what better way to bring you the brand new book today, 20 Years Later by Charlie Donlea. And Jenna Blum is here today, who says, congratulations, Charlie. Jenna back from her own road trip to talk about her new book, Woodrow on the Bench, which is just tearing up the charts, and it will break your heart. And this book is heartbreaking as well. And we can talk about that a little bit too. Let me just take 10 more seconds to introduce you formally, Charlie, in case someone doesn't know you. Hard to believe, but they might not. Charlie Donlea is the critically acclaimed USA Today indie-bound and #1 internationally bestseller of Summit Lake, The Girl Who Was Taken, Don't Believe It, Some Choose Darkness, The Suicide House, and 20 Years Later from Kensington Books. And Kensington Books and Charlie are doing an amazing giveaway today. You can win one of Charlie's books, one of the backlist, and or 20 Years Later, and the magic blazers in the back room will choose which one you get. So 6 commenters, reporters doing math, 6 commenters will win a Charlie Donlea book. So aren't you glad that you came today? And we will announce the winner at the end of our broadcast, so about 40 minutes from now. So Charlie, a little bit more about Charlie. Published in nearly 30 countries and translated into more than a dozen languages, Donlea has been praised for his soaring pace, teasing plot twists, and you won't believe it when you read 20 Years Later, and a talent for writing an ending that makes your jaw drop. And I will say, not just the ending, but the middle and the middle of the middle and the middle of the second part and the middle of the third part and on and on and on. Crazy, wonderful story. He was born and raised in Chicago, me too, where he continues to live with his wife and 2 children. Visit him online at charliedonlea.com, but you can certainly find him. Remember, we are giving away 6 Charlie Donlea books. And finally, it is time for me to stop talking and for you to start talking. And you have given us a book that is impossible to discuss the plot of. So I will let you set it up for us a little bit so I don't make any errors or give anything away.
Well, first, Hank, I need you to join my sales team. The book will fly off the shelves if I have you on my side.
As well it should.
But thank you. Thanks for having me on. And really quickly, as a writing community and talking with my other writing friends, many of whom we thank you for doing this. This started off, like you said, as a way to connect readers and writers when we couldn't do in-person events. And here we are 2 years later, still not fully back to normal. But you've allowed readers to reach us. Many today, I'm sure, haven't read my stuff yet. Many have, but I'm able to reach them and they're able to discover me. And we talked a little bit ahead of time. You taking the time to read the books, to really read them and sort of analyze them and come up with interview questions means a lot to all of us writers. And even after some time in the future, when this is all over, the Mighty Mystery Series, I think, still going to be here as a really great platform and a liaison. So you guys have done a great job, and thank you for today. But for all of the writers out here that I know, we're really appreciative of what you guys have done during this weird time.
Well, thank you. You can be on my sales team. We'll be a good team. Thank you for that.
We'll exchange info. So 20 Years Later is released today. 20 Years Later tells the story of Avery Mason, who's the host of a television magazine news show called American Events, which is basically like Dateline on steroids. And Avery goes to New York City to tell the story of a woman named Victoria Ford, who was killed in 9/11 when the towers fell, when towers collapsed. 20 years later, Victoria Ford's remains have just been identified by the New York City Medical Examiner's Office using new DNA technology. And Avery wants to go to New York to tell this story to her audience about Victoria Ford. But when she gets to New York, she discovers that Victoria Ford was, at the time of her death, the main suspect in a murder investigation that ended when 9/11 happened. And Avery meets Victoria's family, who still today believe that she's innocent and have been trying for 20 years to prove her innocence. And they think Avery, with her connection to her show and fame, has the best chance of doing this. So Avery decides to reinvestigate this 20-year-old cold case. And the new evidence she stumbles over today does not match the narrative from 20 years ago. And that's how the story is set up and takes off. And there's lots of twists and turns. And what I hope is a surprise ending that has readers ripping back through the pages. to see how he missed it.
That is exactly what happened to me. I have to tell you, I always think I'm really good at figuring out things, not just the ending, but the interim twist that any good writer like you has. And you just, every moment I was gasping and thinking, oh my golly, how did he do that? We can talk about that in a minute, but let's go back to Avery, because first of all, I've been in television, as you know, for 43 years, and you got television right. The nuance and the competition and the comparison and the ratings and the struggle and the agents, all so wonderful. And we think we know who Avery is and what she wants, but that changes. Where did Avery come from in your brain?
So I've had a couple of my novels, Don't Believe It, and The Suicide House, to a little bit of a degree, that had to do with making a serial-like podcast and a serial-like television documentary. And so, especially for Don't Believe It, I had done a lot of research. I talked to a lot of producers at NBC to, not to get everything perfect, but just to get it close enough that it's believable. And so I've had this idea of, not so much a Katie Couric, but I had this idea of a news magazine host who is really popular, who goes to tell a story that she thinks is just a regular commercial story that's going to be, good for the ratings, but stumbles over something else. And I started and stopped this story a couple of times before I sat down and I wrote Avery's story. And I said, finally, Avery Mason is this character I've been trying to write. She's, on a Friday night, American Events, like I said, it's Dateline on steroids. She's the host of this show that's watched every week by millions and millions of people. Her forte is true crime. Anytime a suburban mom goes missing or someone disappears and ends up on People magazine, she's on the case and she's telling the story. And so she came from a couple other characters, Avery did, from a couple other characters that I wrote, and they turned into something else, and they had their own other stories and their own other novels that they ended up in. But Avery is a special character that I loved writing. And we talked a little bit, Hank, writing during the pandemic. This was my escape. I went and wrote about this fictional character, Avery Mason, and it was just, sometimes writing is not the most fun. Everyone likes having written, but not necessarily the writing process. But when I was writing Avery's scenes, I really loved them all, and I ended up loving this character as much as any of my others.
I don't know if you saw Donna Shaw's comment a minute ago that we had on the screen that was talking about, oh, here it is. Both of you are such marvelous writers. Thank you, Donna. When you started describing the book, I thought, is he writing with Hank in mind? Now, I now see, Donna, what you might be thinking, that maybe I am Avery Mason, but that isn't what I thought when I read this comment initially. I thought you meant, are you writing the kind of book that Hank would love to read? Because that is exactly correct. When I started reading this book, when I started reading about Avery, I thought, I'm going to love this. I'm going to love this. I'm going to love this. And then as I continued to love it, it turned into another story altogether. We think we know what Avery Mason wants. And then Walt Jenkins comes into her life and changes the story, turns the story on its head a little bit. Talk to us about Walt Jenkins a little bit and how that affects her life. And how she affects his.
Yeah. So the interesting thing with Walt Jenkins is, I don't know your writing process, Hank. I'm a plotter, not a pantser. My friend Mary Kubica gave me a good teaching on the differences, because we were doing an interview together, and she said she was a pantser, and I was like, "What is a pantser?" Writing from the seat of her pants, no outline, just whatever comes to her that day. I'm the opposite of that. I'm a plotter, and I need an outline, and I need to know where the story's going for me to sit down and comfortably write. There's too much anxiety when I write from scratch, because not that I can't find the words. It's just that I write with this dread that everything I'm doing today or this week is going to be deleted because I'm going in the wrong direction. Wow. But even being a plotter, Walt Jenkins' character was a tiny secondary character in the original outline, and he turned out to be basically like a co-protagonist and someone else who I just loved his character. But yeah, so he is a retired sort of FBI agent. He's sort of retired. He was asked to leave the FBI for an event that happened, and so he's sort of a recluse in Jamaica when Avery goes to tell the story of Victoria Ford. And it turns out that Walt was 20 years ago the original investigator. He was the detective in the murder investigation that Victoria Ford was involved in. So Avery reaches out to him when she decides to reinvestigate this murder. And, they both are sort of reinventing themselves. Avery is running from her sort of an infamous family past. Walt is running from this sort of survivor's guilt that he has in an event that caused him to leave the FBI. And they're sort of running from their past brings them together. And it's funny when you think of these characters and how they take off about 40 or 50% through the writing process in ways that you didn't expect and you didn't plan on. They sort of start telling you the story about 50% of the way through the manuscript. And those two, they're running from their past. If they didn't meet each other, we don't know what would have happened with them. I don't know that they would have ended up being as happy or successful as they ended up being. And their past brought them together, and then together they're able to sort of help each other, not only in the present. Walt helps Avery with her current investigation, and Avery helps Walt get over his survivor's guilt. But that just comes from their own past. They can't help themselves, but they're able to use their past to help each other.
And I love that, that they're working together and they change each other's lives. But this theme of baggage, and I use the term carefully, and getting rid of your past and becoming someone else and reinventing yourself, and the precariousness of that, and how much, and whether that's even possible, is a theme of your whole book.
It is. I mean, I think getting back to the escapism that I look to fiction for as a reader, I read books to escape my everyday life. And I think that's how most people read. And I think that there's a little bit of sort of a desire on my part as a reader, but I think readers in general, to put themselves into the place of a character or protagonist that they like. And, to see that, well, they're stuck in a rut and they can get out of this rut and change their lives. And I think we're all hoping to maybe shake off baggage or something that holds us back, whatever it is in life. And so when you read a character that's able to do it, it's a little inspirational, even though it's a novel. I think we all as readers look to those characters and see a little bit of ourselves in them. That's how we connect with the character and what we like about them.
I completely agree. And both of the characters are incredibly endearing. And I want you all to know that when I look over here, I'm looking at the comments. I'm not looking away from you. And I'm welcoming Jamie is here, and Shannon is here, and Sharon is here. And of course, our darling Jenna and Sharon. So many people here today as we're talking about 20 years later, this wonderful, thrilling, twisty, surprising book by Charlie Donlea that just came out today. We were talking about plotting and pantsing, and I love Mary Kubica. She's just such an icon, and I too am a pantser. I have no idea what's going to happen. I typed chapter 1. I know we'll have to talk about it.
You're getting me anxious.
Well, no, but think about this, because you have thought like a pantser too, and I'll tell you why. Because Avery is a pantser. Every reporter is a pantser, because you're starting out with an idea, sort of a possibility, a theory, and you're following the leads and tracking down clues and talking to people and doing interviews to find out what the real answer is. And that's what she does in this book. She's relentlessly tracking down clues. And that's how I think I write. I mean, after 40 years as a reporter, I don't know the ending of my stories. If I did, they wouldn't be new. So, right. So they'd be old. So I'm not afraid of not knowing the ending. And Avery is relentlessly pursuing this story as it gets better and better and better and better. And she has to tread carefully because there are a couple of levers that she can't have snap. There's her past, which is possibly following her. And there's how careful she has to be about that part of the story takes place as a result of September 11th. And you must have had to juggle that a little bit as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think what helps me in response or relationship to the 9/11 aspect of the story is this really happened. As a matter of fact, in September of this year, there was a New York Times article about remains of 9/11 victims in the Twin Towers being identified 20 years later. Mm-hmm. By this new DNA technology. It's actually it's fact that this is happening. It was strange that it came out with the title 20 years later. My book was nicely reviewed by the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, and within the context of the review, Sarah Lyle, who did the review, she linked to the New York Times article about identifying victims 20 years later with this new DNA technology. So there's a little bit of reality to this that helps me approach the 9/11 aspect because you can look it up and see that it's real. But yeah, for Avery, she wasn't quite sure that she didn't know, like you were saying, Hank, she didn't know this about Victoria Ford. She went to, do a story about her being identified 20 years later, and then stumbled over when she started doing her research. She stumbled over the fact that Victoria was involved with this murder investigation and was the main suspect of this brutal murder that took place in the Catskill Mountains. And then she switches gears and dives into this other story. What Avery has to be careful about is Victoria's family has put so much faith in her as this celebrity journalist to get answers for them and to prove that Victoria was innocent. And not everything Avery finds is clearly cut that Victoria is innocent. And so she has to kind of balance the aspects of wanting to do a sensational story for a news magazine show, which the ratings stem strictly from sensationalism, but yet being truthful to Victoria's family about everything she learned. So there's definitely some balancing there. Plus the fact that Avery's hiding a lot of secrets, and so is Walt, who's helping her with the story. So there's a lot of balancing that the reader knows about, and there's a lot of balancing that the reader knows about that Avery is unaware of, which makes the story fun.
Quickly, let me say that if anyone is thinking about 9/11, I have to really applaud you for being so respectful and so careful, and the fact that 9/11 exists in this book is handled with such care and such loving understanding that it's very realistic and quite wonderful. And I applaud you. I applaud you for that. One of the things that we always talk about as thriller writers is how everybody has a secret. Earlier you were talking about how Avery never quite came together until she did. Was it her secret that made her be whole, or how do you come up with? I mean, every single important character in this book has an important secret, and it's all about who's going to tell the secret and what happens if the secret is told and what is the secret. How did you deal with secrets?
Well, it's funny when you know this, Hank, when you write a book and you get to the end and then you start doing the edits, you sometimes can recognize themes you didn't know you put in there. You didn't do it intentionally. You didn't write it into the story intentionally. And when I finished the first manuscript, I went back and I saw this quote that I put in the front of the book, and it says, from progress, from invention is born progress, and from reinvention is born freedom. And I realized this quote is so sort of poignant throughout the whole story, that all these characters aren't just running from their past, they're trying to reinvent themselves in some way. And so on the second draft, that's when these secrets and reinventing, each character reinventing themselves sort of took off and was enhanced during the editing process. And that's when you really know your characters, when they're sort of telling you what's going on, and you can see an overall arcing theme to their stories, which is probably why the editing process for me is the most enjoyable and rewarding part of the writing process.
Oh, I so agree. When you see those things that you wonder, that you almost didn't notice that you put in, and then they all had some meaning. When you edit a book, when I do at least, it's as if at some point you sort of see the book you meant to write, and you think, how did that happen? Oh, okay. And
it's your subconscious, right? I mean, it's your subconscious then coming to your awareness, because you're not, when you're in the thick of things, you're not totally aware of of those underlying themes. And when you go back and you come from it from a different perspective, all those things sort of show up, and it's a little magical, it's a little inspiring, and definitely that's what motivates me when I get to the point of the edits and the rewrites. It's just a really rewarding process for me.
Sue Grafton used to call it the magic, and it is so interesting. Mighty Blaze is saying, like an impressionist stepping back from their painting, themes can appear long after an author finishes a book. And just like an impressionist painting, that the whole is this more than the sum of the parts. You don't even know what the parts are until they go together to make this puzzle, as now I'm ruining this metaphor totally. So just move on. Speaking of parts of the novel, though, this is structurally quite brilliant, because there are several things that you use other than a regular narrative type of book to make the story progress. Talk a little bit about how you decided to use those other elements to, it's more like giving us an insight into the reality. You use those structural elements to make the stories feel real.
Yeah, so a lot of that has to do with, whatever your writing team is. My editor, John Scolamilio, I presented this idea of telling a story in like half the book in flashback. And I've done that before, and I think it worked really successfully in The Girl Who Was Taken. Every other chapter was an italics chapter that happened sometime in the past. And he got me off of that. He said, you did it once, it's too soon. Let's try tell the backstory a different way. And that's always challenging for me, because, all my books, this is just my writing process. I want to show the reader what happened in the past. And you got to find different ways to do that. And so one of the sort of structural techniques I used in this was when Walt Jenkins, who's the retired FBI agent, shows up in New York, and he agrees to help Avery look into this 20-year-old cold case, this murder investigation, to reinvestigate it. He goes back and finds the files on the old paper files on the investigation, and he reads it. And as soon as he opens it up, the narration, the chapter goes into what he's reading and shows the reader what he did as a 28-year-old detective. And that was that. I think it's a clever way to do it. I wouldn't have thought of it on my own. That comes from my editor telling me, don't just do a flashback. Find something more creative. So it was John challenged me to do that. And I'm glad he did, because it made me kind of step back and say, how can I show the reader, not just tell them by reading a transcript from from 20 years ago? How can I show the reader what Walt did? You know what happened in the beginning because there's a little flashback scene. How can I show the reader what happens up to that point where they find the victim hanging from a balcony in the Catskill Mountains? How do I show that? And so the way I came up with that was he gets the old files, Walt does, and he reads through them. And then through his reading, the narration actually goes into a flashback of what he did, who he interviewed, what he discovered, the DNA evidence that he discovered and how he discovered and what did it point to, and what the medical examiner told him and discovered when he did the autopsy on the body. So the reader gets to see all those things rather than just hear about them through long paragraphs. I mean, I think it was a clever way to do it. And I thank my editor for helping me get to that point.
Well, John is obviously a genius editor. Everybody knows that. We all know that. But I do have to say, Charlie, that he had the idea, great, but you did it and did it beautifully. And one of the things that happens sometimes is in books is that when there's a big flashback, it sort of takes the reader out of the book because it's like, here, we're stopping the story. Now, wait a minute, we're going to go back. But this, the way you presented it in 20 years later, which don't forget, we are giving away a copy of, as well as Charlie's backlist. So don't forget to leave a question or a comment. The way you did it was to brought the reader into the book, deeper into the book, into the story, and deeper into Walt as well, how he was and how he behaved and what might have happened and how he felt as 20 years later, a story that he thought he knew emerges to be possibly something else.
Yeah, for sure. He thought he knew the narrative. I mean, but he was a newly minted homicide detective. That was his first case. He was hand chosen to look into this high profile murder. And so he was green and he didn't know what he was doing. He was nervous. And his main objective was not to screw it up, to get an answer, to get it quickly, to get a notch in his belt. And now he's in his mid 40s, 20 years later, he's 48 years old. And he hasn't thought about the case since 9/11, since the investigation went up in smoke. And now he's forced to go back and look at it through a man in his middle age rather than a young rookie detective. He's forced to look at it with a different perspective. And that's when he starts realizing, with Avery's help and what she starts to discover, that maybe he got it wrong. And maybe everything he thought he knew originally wasn't correct. And then, there's some worry that he has put this family through 20 years of anguish and maybe got this murder investigation wrong. And so that's what motivates him to dig deeper for the truth.
I mean, it's interesting because one, what we were talking about earlier about how we as authors go through our manuscripts and see things that we didn't see initially. This is exactly what Walt is doing when he's going through this evidence to see, oh, now he's looking at it another way and sees what emerges from what seemed to be a pretty cut and dried case when he started. And what you're talking about now also reminds me another thing that's so wonderful about this book. And again, I hope you will come back and look at the comments when we're finished today, because I know it's difficult for you to look at them now, but there is just applause and cheer and adulation and people saying, what a great story. Charlie is a new author for me. Can't wait to read this. I'm excited to read. So, this on Mighty Mysteries, our goal is to have all of your to be read piles just go up and up and up. And I know we're doing that today with 20 Years Later by Charlie Donlea and the fabulous giveaway. But the other thing that you reminded me of is the theme of family in this book, how much people's families mean to them for better or for worse, and how far someone would go to harm or protect or take care of their families. And wow, Charlie, your sleight of hand on this one, which we will say no more about, was great. But let's talk about family a little bit and what role that plays in this book.
Well, for sure. I mean, Avery's running. Her family has this infamous past. She has a dad who's sort of like Bernie Madoff. He was very, very wealthy man who ran a hedge fund, and he ended up being investigated for running a Ponzi scheme. And so Avery is trapped in this impossible, like in between hating her father and being totally trapped by unconditional love. I mean, she cannot give up the fact that she still loves her dad, even though he's this terrible person. And it sort of gets Avery's relationship with her family. We won't, like you said, Hank, we don't want to give too much away, but it's sort of like, whenever I write these stories, I give them to my wife and I give them to my sister to give me early feedback. And so some of it, I ask, is this believable?
Mm-hmm.
And my sister says something like, you could call me and say, grab a shovel on your way over. I got a body in the back I need help with. And she would say, all right, I'll be over before dinner. It's this unconditional love that you're going to do anything for your family, your blood family, that sort of is woven throughout this book. And there's a little bit of, this is what I'm hoping, without giving anything away, this is what I'm hoping readers get shocked about, where they get to the end and they realize that perhaps there was some clues that they missed along the way. And that's the other thing, Hank, we talked about. Being a thriller writer is really challenging and frustrating, because every reader reads as a detective and says, I'm going to figure this out before I get to the end. And trying to avoid them doing that is a real challenge. And when it works, it's outstanding. And when they guess it ahead of time, you still got them to the end. So it's still an enjoyable process. But there's some sleight of hand in here that I hope ends up as a big surprise.
Well, let me say something quickly. How I think about that is, I've said that when my husband and I watched a mystery on television, and I'm trying to guess it the entire time. Oh, it's the sister. Oh, she's pregnant. Oh, somebody's going to drown, whatever it is. And he'll say, well, can't you just watch it? And I think, no, I can't just watch it. I have to figure it out. And he can just watch it. A criminal defense attorney, he can just watch it. And I do think that it's equally fun in a book for me as a reader. If I figure it out, I think, oh, I'm so smart when I'm right at the end. And if I don't figure it out, I think, wow, that the author is smarter than I am. That's cool too. So either experience is an enjoyable experience, especially when a book is so gorgeously written and surprising as your book is 20 years later. Sherry says, you shocked me, says Sherry. So there, you got one.
Got you, Sherry. I got you.
One final question before Mindy says, I have friends that do that in the movie theater, Hank. Oh, that's annoying. Like, oh, it's that guy. Who's that guy? About fame. And I think that you tackle this very beautifully in this book as well. Avery is famous, and she gets things because she's famous. People welcome her into their homes because she's famous. On the other hand, there's also notoriety. That is the opposite side of fame. And the juggle of that is something that she has to do as well.
Yeah, it is. So Avery escapes sort of her family's infamy by going to Los Angeles to try to start over. And it's sort of by accident. I think there's a line in the book that she wasn't looking for fame, but when she found it, she's going to ride it until the wave runs out. But she wasn't looking for it, and her fame happened so suddenly that it's basically in one season. The American Events turns her into this really, really popular television personality, television journalist, and it happens so quickly. And I think we've had this happen to us. She doesn't know how to stop this. And she's using an alias. She's using like a Hollywood name. Avery Mason's not her birth name, but she didn't want to go out and use her family name because it was infamous. So she uses Avery Mason, and she becomes so famous so quickly that she doesn't know what to do. She's worried that people are going to find out, and they will. It's obvious they have to. There's no way to hide it. But in the immediate moment of this year or two of rising in fame, so many more people know her as this famous television personality than know her as this, high school girl in New York whose family, was disgraced by their father, that she doesn't know how to handle this. And she's sort of racing to try to get her contract negotiations done before she drops this bomb. And the story that she ends up doing about Victoria Ford ends up leading into a way for her to out of that situation. Again, unexpected to her. She wasn't planning on that, but it came through her investigation.
And that's one of the many things that makes us love Avery so much. She's very human. She has a secret, and she's struggling, good versus bad, loyalty versus selfishness, all those kinds of wonderful things that makes this book be so absolutely terrific. 20 years later, by Charlie Donlea. As you can tell, I highly recommend this book. It's really, really good. I was trying to read it more slowly because I thought, I just want to find out what happens. I want to find out what happens. But your writing is so beautiful that I made myself slow down a little bit so I could take in. I noticed that you quoted your sister about the body burying. I burst out laughing when you said that a minute ago. We do have questions from the audience. And shall we take a few of those, though? Are you ready? How do you decide, says Catherine. Hey, Catherine. How do you decide whether to write a standalone or continue a series?
Great question. I've always resisted writing a series until, again, my editor sort of talked me into it. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Some Choose Darkness. And in that book, I created this character named Rory Moore, who's an autistic investigator for the Chicago Police Department. And she ended up being this really dynamic character. And I didn't plan all the things that she became, but she became this really great character. And the book, my publishing house loved the book here and in Australia and in Brazil. Everybody loved the book. All the editors loved the book. And so when I sat down to do the next one, they all asked if I would do another Rory Moore book, which I was against for the simple reason that I always felt if you write too many books in a row with the same character, it can turn readers off. It's like when I sit down and I hear about a great book and I see that there's 19 of those, I don't know that I have the energy to start from the beginning and read them all through. So when I wrote the Rory Moore books, which is Some Choose Darkness and The Suicide House, I was really careful to mention that they have the same character, but they're totally independent books. You don't have to read them in either order. And so all of my books really have been standalone novels. I think that for me as a writer, when you get done with a manuscript, you sort of, Hank, you've had enough of that character for a little bit, even though I love Avery. When you spend a year with her and a couple hours a day or more with her, it's like when you're done, she is so ingrained in your mind that it's sort of healthy to meet a new character and to create a new character. I will say, though, that I'm writing my 7th. I'm just about done with it. And I'm pretty sure the 8th book we've been talking is going to be a 3rd Rory Moore book. But I'm going to be really careful. They'll be part of a series, but can be read in any order.
Yes, I've written 2 series, and that was one of the things that was really top of mind for me, that if you pick up any of them in any order, they're a perfectly wonderful standalone that you don't have to have any of the earlier books. It's just a character who you come to know in a wonderful adventure. And then there's closure to that book and you go on to whatever else you want to read.
Perfect.
Of course.
Exactly.
Okay, that's great. I'd love to know what you all think in the comments too about whether if you find out that an author, if you've got book 19, do you go back to book 1 or can you read book 19? I'm fine with reading book 19, but I know there are people who aren't. So that's why they're books for everyone. What other questions do you have, you all? Was there anything in your research that you were reluctant to use in the book? Asks Anissa. That's a great question.
So answer that, I'll say there's something I was really anxious to use and then something I was reluctant to get too involved with. There's when I was doing research for this book, I was just reading headlines. I wasn't reading the articles. I was just reading headline after headline after headline. And in 2018 or so, I read a headline that said, 9/11 victims, their remains are still being identified this many years later using this new DNA technology. And this new DNA technology is like revolutionary and is going to be hopefully used to identify everyone else who was involved in 9/11, but has been used in mass casualties when, you can't, DNA is not as simple as taking a victim's blood or, swabbing their mouth. For instance, in a plane crash, you have to use, you don't necessarily have, not to be gruesome, but an entire body to take DNA from. You have to take what you can find. And sometimes it's just remnants of the victim. And so in 9/11, there's still to this day, tens of thousands of artifacts of bone and teeth and other aspects that have been recovered that have not yet been identified, because those small pieces, extracting DNA from those small remains, is nearly impossible. And only recently, in the last few years, has this DNA technology come around that allows a small bone fragment to be pulverized, liquefied, and have DNA extracted from it to try to match against sample DNA that victim's family have provided to New York medical examiner. So I was fascinated. I have a science background, so I was fascinated with this research, but I was also really trying not to bog the story down with getting too much into the weeds of that research, because I love Tom Clancy books, but in his heyday, sometimes I would kind of skim over, the inner workings of a submarine, because I couldn't really relate to it. So I was trying my hardest to present the DNA in this book in just maybe a couple paragraphs as being new technology, but not weighing the reader down, even though in my science mind, I wanted to go into the weeds and tell you all about it.
Well, I think you handled it so beautifully with a wonderful character who does explain it in a very engaging but respectful kind of way. I'm really a great character, and also the science was explained in a clear way that makes the reader feel smart, and you tell us just enough that we need to know to go on. And handled very, very well. I mean, it is evidence. One of the reasons that your publisher so gorgeously provided your book in an evidence bag, which was chilling and wonderful. And I couldn't wait to open it. I'm looking through my pictures now to find next week's book, which just went away. Anyway, we have time, I think, for one more question, if there's another question. Charlie, do you have a favorite place to write? Asks Sherry.
This is my office. I used to, when I first started, I used to write at Starbucks and coffee houses, and but that's hard to do. And I used to do it because I thought there was less distractions there than at home. But then we sort of, decided, my wife and I decided I actually needed a real place to write. So we created an office with doors, and I can close the doors. And, there's times when getting ready for school is a little bit of a challenge, and I got to take a break and get everybody out of the house. But my office this is my laboratory.
That's great. It's beautiful. I love all your books
behind you
and the Christmas decorations. Let me close today by saying, Charlie, amazing evidence of a wonderful upside down, again, a bestseller. This is going to be all the buzz. This is quite a spectacular book, and we will be giving this book away. You and your publisher Kensington. Oh, look who won! Look at all these people: Sharon Hansen, Hannah Mary McKinnon, Sherry Steuben, Sharon Carlson, Person, Catherine Holloman, Gail Rosenfeld, all won.
Congratulations!
Book.
Well done.
Yeah, that's great, and thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Kensington, and the rest of you. If you got gift cards for the holidays, guess what would be a wonderful way to spend part of that card to get this brand new fabulous thriller 20 years later by Charlie Donlea. Charlie, congratulations on your
Thanks, Hank.
birthday. And
Thank
it's been wonderful to have you. Next week, you all, quickly before you go, Charlie, next week, we will be hearing from Nita Prose about her brand new debut novel called The Maid. I'm sorry for the lights, but look at the lights are not on the cover. The Maid, look at that elegant, cool, brilliant cover of The Maid. We will be talking to Nita Prose next week at 4 p.m. ET right here on A Mighty Mystery on A Mighty Blaze. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Charlie. Happy New Year to everyone, as Anissa says. Stay safe, you all, and we will see you next time.